I am Melissa, 21 years old, and I never thought my childhood bedroom would become the site of the most difficult moral decision of my life. After 10 months away at college, I was excited to sleep in my old room, surrounded by memories. But when I arrived home, something was wrong. My bedroom door was locked with a new deadbolt. "Do not go in there," my mom said firmly. "It is just for storage now," my dad added, his eyes darting away nervously. Their behavior seemed off, almost frightened. That night, I used my old emergency key and opened the door anyway. What I found inside made me call 911 5 minutes later. Drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you are ready to hear about the family secret that changed my understanding of right and wrong forever. My life at Stanford University in California was everything I had worked for during high school. As a third-year psychology major, I was thriving academically and had found my perfect social circle. My roommate Rachel and I had become inseparable since freshman orientation. We just clicked, both passionate about understanding human behavior and social justice. Together, we volunteered at the campus crisis hotline, putting our developing counseling skills to good use. I had been dating Thomas for about 8 months. He studied pre-med and worked part-time at the university hospital. Thomas was brilliant, kind, and understood my crazy schedule. We bonded over late-night study sessions and our shared dream of helping others. When I told him I was going home for Thanksgiving break, he encouraged me to reconnect with my family, knowing how much I missed them, despite our occasional differences. 10 months had passed since my last visit home. The demanding course load and summer internship in San Francisco meant I had only spoken to my family through video calls. Part of me felt guilty about staying away so long, but my parents always encouraged my independence. "Focus on your studies, Melissa," my mom would say. "We will always be here when you are ready to visit." Home was a modest 4-bedroom house in Boulder, Colorado. I grew up surrounded by mountains and outdoor adventures. My childhood was filled with hiking trips, winter ski lessons, and summer camping excursions. My parents believed in experiencing nature as a way to build character. These activities formed some of my fondest memories. My relationship with my parents was loving, but had grown more distant as I entered adulthood. My father, James, owned a small but successful construction company. He built our house himself 25 years ago when he and Mom got married. Dad was the practical one, teaching me how to change a tire and fix a leaky faucet before I was 12. He was reserved emotionally, but showed his love through acts of service. Whenever I mentioned a problem, his first response was always, "How can we fix it?" Mom, Elizabeth, worked as a nurse at Boulder Community Hospital for over 20 years. She specialized in emergency care and often worked night shifts. Growing up, I admired her compassion and the way she could remain calm in crisis situations. Mom always had stories about patients whose lives she had helped save. She instilled in me a deep respect for healthcare workers and the importance of helping those in need. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how passionate she became when discussing patients who fell through the cracks of the healthcare system. My younger brother, Kyle, was 17 and in his senior year of high school. Always the athlete of the family, he was hoping for a track scholarship to Colorado State. Kyle and I were close despite the typical sibling rivalries. He spent most of his time at practice or with his girlfriend, Jessica, so he was rarely home in the evenings. This detail would become important later. My childhood bedroom had remained largely unchanged since high school. The walls were still painted light blue, my choice when I was 13 and wanted a more grown-up color. Shelves lined with books, academic awards, and track trophies documented my journey through adolescence. Photos of friends, family, vacations, and high school graduation were displayed on a corkboard above my desk. My favorite possession was a telescope my parents gave me for my 16th birthday, still positioned by the window overlooking our backyard and the mountains beyond. The room represented safety and stability, a physical space that held my history. Whenever I returned from college, sleeping in that room helped me reconnect with myself and my roots. I expected this visit to be no different, a chance to recharge in familiar surroundings before returning to the pressures of university life. The flight from San Francisco to Denver lasted just over 2 hours. I spent the time reviewing notes from my developmental psychology paper due after the break. As the plane descended, I felt the familiar anticipation of coming home mixed with a strange nervousness. Perhaps it was because I had been away longer than usual, or maybe some part of me sensed something was different this time. I texted my parents from the airport, landed safely. Cannot wait to see you all. Mom responded immediately with a string of heart emojis, but no actual words, which was unusual for her. Typically, she would ask about the flight or tell me what she was cooking for dinner. This small deviation from our normal communication pattern was the first subtle indication that something had changed. As I collected my luggage and headed toward the arrival area, I imagined sleeping in my comfortable bed, browsing through old yearbooks, and rediscovering forgotten mementos. I had no idea that my bedroom had become the center of a secret that would test my values and forever alter my understanding of my parents. Dad picked me up from the airport alone, explaining that Mom had been called into work unexpectedly. This was our first deviation from tradition, as both parents usually greeted me together, regardless of their schedules. Dad seemed distracted during the drive home, his responses to my questions about work and local news uncharacteristically brief. When I asked about Mom's schedule, he gave vague answers about her picking up extra shifts. "Your mom has been working overtime lately," he said, eyes fixed on the road. "The hospital is short-staffed." "Is everything okay?" I asked. "You seem tense." "Just tired from a big project," he replied, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "How about some music?" He turned up the radio, effectively ending our conversation. I noticed his knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The house looked the same from the outside, the blue shutters my mom had insisted on, and the maple tree in the front yard, now bare for winter. But once inside, subtle differences were immediately apparent. The living room furniture had been rearranged to make space for additional storage boxes. Medical journals and paperwork were hastily stacked on the coffee table, something my orderly mother would never normally allow. "What is with all the boxes?" I asked, gesturing toward the cluttered space. "Just some hospital donations your mom is organizing?" Dad answered too quickly. "We have been using your room for overflow." Speaking of which, this was when he first mentioned that my bedroom was being used for storage and that I would be sleeping in the guest room during my visit. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, but his nervous demeanor contradicted his casual tone. Mom arrived home an hour later looking exhausted, but brightening when she saw me. We hugged tightly, and I noticed she had lost weight. Dark circles underlined her eyes, suggesting many sleepless nights. She avoided discussions about work, instead asking endless questions about my classes and friends, barely giving me time to inquire about her life. During dinner, I casually mentioned wanting to get some old books from my bedroom. The reaction was immediate and alarming. Mom's fork clattered against her plate, and Dad interrupted with unusual forcefulness. "Do not go in there," Mom said firmly. "It is just for storage now." "The floor is covered in boxes," Dad added. "Too dangerous to navigate. Plus, there is a mold issue we are addressing." Nothing serious, but better to stay out until it is fixed. Their explanations piled up, contradictory. First, it was simple storage, then potential mold. Then, Dad mentioned ongoing repairs to the ceiling. Each new excuse made less sense. I noticed them exchanging glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Kyle seemed oblivious, focused on his phone and contributing little to the conversation. When I caught him alone in the kitchen later, I asked if he knew what was happening with my room. "No idea," he shrugged, but his eyes darted away. "They have been weird about it for weeks. I do not go upstairs much anyway." That night, I was awakened by hushed voices. Creeping to my door, I heard my parents in the hallway speaking in urgent whispers. "The antibiotics are not working fast enough," Mom said. "We might need to consider other options." "It is too risky," Dad replied. "We cannot involve anyone else." "James, I cannot just watch her condition deteriorate." "Not when I know how to help." "And what happens if Melissa finds out? Have you thought about what this could do to her? To all of us?" Their footsteps moved toward my old bedroom, and I heard the distinct sound of a key turning in a lock. For 20 minutes, I remained frozen, listening to muffled activity before they returned downstairs. The next morning, I noticed more oddities. The medicine cabinet, usually organized with basic first aid supplies, now contained prescription bottles with the labels removed. The basement door, typically left open, was locked. Dad's toolbox sat in the hallway with surgical gloves on top, an incongruous pairing. Multiple calls came to the house phone, which had rarely rung in the smartphone era. Mom answered them in hushed tones, often stepping outside despite the cold November air. Once I overheard her saying, "No change yet. We might need another consultation." While searching for laundry detergent, I discovered a bag containing blood-stained towels soaking in hydrogen peroxide. When questioned, Mom claimed she had cut herself at work and brought the towels home to avoid wasting hospital resources. Most disturbing was the unmarked van that parked briefly in our driveway one afternoon. A man in scrubs carried a cooler inside, meeting briefly with my father in the garage before departing. When I inquired, Dad claimed it was supplies for a project, changing the subject immediately. Late one evening, while everyone thought I was asleep, I overheard Dad speaking with an unfamiliar man in the kitchen. "The situation is becoming untenable," the stranger said. "Elizabeth is putting her career on the line. Your family could face serious consequences." "What choice do we have?" Dad responded. "The system failed her. We cannot just abandon her now." The conversation ended abruptly when Kyle returned from his girlfriend's house. The stranger left through the back door, careful to avoid being seen. Most telling were the strange sounds coming from my old bedroom. Twice I heard what sounded like moaning, followed by my mother's soothing voice. Once, in the middle of the night, I distinctly heard beeping, like medical equipment, quickly silenced. Each new discovery increased my concern. What had my parents involved themselves in? Who was the her they kept referencing? Why was my childhood bedroom at the center of their secret? The tension in the house was palpable, creating an atmosphere of unspoken anxiety that contradicted the warm family home I remembered. On the third day of my visit, I finally had the house to myself. Mom was called into work for an emergency shift. Dad had a meeting with a client, and Kyle was at track practice. This was my opportunity to investigate without interruption. I started in my parents' bedroom, feeling guilty, but determined to understand what was happening. In their bathroom, I found a prescription pad from the hospital, something Mom should never have taken home. Several pages had been torn out. The medicine cabinet contained vials of antibiotics labeled "for hospital use only," along with syringes still in their sterile packaging. Dad's desk drawer revealed another troubling discovery: a folder containing medical records for someone named Maria Garcia, a 43-year-old woman with no health insurance. The documents detailed a severe infection following an emergency appendectomy, with notes about being discharged prematurely due to insurance limitations. Mom's handwriting covered the margins with treatment plans and medication dosages. One notation read, "Patient rejected from readmission due to payment status. Condition deteriorating. Alternative intervention necessary." In the laundry room, more evidence mounted. A set of scrubs with the hospital logo was soaking in bleach. Dad's work shirts had small blood stains on the sleeves. A garbage bag contained empty IV bags and used medical packaging, carefully wrapped to avoid detection. Most disturbing was what I found in the garage: a small refrigerator, padlocked shut. Using the spare key, hidden above the doorframe, I opened it to discover bags of saline solution, medication vials, and, most shockingly, 2 bags of blood marked with type and expiration dates. My heart raced as pieces began fitting together. My parents were providing medical care to someone, possibly this Maria Garcia, inside my bedroom. They had converted the space into some kind of makeshift hospital room. But why? And how dangerous was their situation? When Kyle returned home, I confronted him in the backyard where our parents could not overhear. "Kyle, I know something strange is happening. I found medical supplies and documents. Someone is in my bedroom, aren't they?" His face paled. "You should not be asking about this, Melissa. Seriously. Have you seen who is in there?" He shook his head. "Only glimpsed someone once when Mom was bringing in food. A woman. Looked pretty sick. I have heard noises too, especially at night." "Why did you not tell me?" "Mom made me promise not to say anything. Said it was a matter of life and death." He kicked at the grass nervously. "They argued about it before you came home. Dad wanted to move everything to the basement, but Mom said it was too cold down there for someone in that condition." "Do you know who she is?" "Some patient of Mom's. That is all I know. Dad told me to forget what I saw and never go near that room." Kyle looked genuinely frightened. "Melissa, I think they could get in serious trouble. Mom could lose her nursing license or worse." That evening, I researched local news on my laptop, looking for any mention of missing persons or healthcare controversies. A story from 3 weeks earlier caught my attention: local hospital under fire for patient dumping claims. The article detailed allegations that Boulder Community Hospital had discharged several uninsured patients before they were medically stable, including a Hispanic woman who had disappeared after being turned away from readmission. I tried calling Thomas for advice, but reception in our house had always been spotty. When we finally connected, I could only speak vaguely about my concerns, aware my parents might overhear. "Something weird is happening with my parents," I whispered. "I think they might be breaking the law, but possibly for the right reasons." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his voice tiny through the poor connection. "They have converted my bedroom into some kind of medical space. I think my mom is treating someone who was denied care at the hospital." "Melissa, that is seriously illegal. Your mom could lose her license, face criminal charges." "I know, but what if they are trying to save someone's life? What would you do?" The call dropped before he could answer, leaving me alone with my moral dilemma. That night, I lay awake planning how to access my bedroom. The new deadbolt required a key my parents kept closely guarded. I remembered the house's original keys from my childhood, wondering if the old emergency key hidden in my desk drawer might still work on the interior lock beneath the deadbolt. My opportunity would come tomorrow. Mom mentioned a church potluck they would all attend. I would plead a headache to stay behind, giving me the chance to discover exactly what my parents were hiding. As I drifted to sleep, I heard it again. A faint moan from behind my bedroom door, followed by my mother's footsteps and the gentle sound of her voice providing comfort to someone in pain. My fear mixed with a growing understanding that whatever my parents were doing, they believed it was necessary and right. But necessary and right did not mean legal or safe. The weight of what I might discover tomorrow pressed heavily on my conscience. What would I do if my suspicions were confirmed? Would I become complicit in their secret, or would my sense of ethical responsibility compel me to report them? In my psychology ethics class, we had debated moral dilemmas involving healthcare access and professional responsibilities. Those theoretical discussions now seemed painfully relevant to my real life. By this time tomorrow, I would know the truth, and whatever I discovered would force a decision that could change my family forever. Sunday morning arrived with a knot of anxiety in my stomach. At breakfast, I complained of a migraine, pressing my fingers against my temples for added effect. "Maybe you should stay home and rest," Mom suggested, concern evident in her voice. "Are you sure?" Dad asked, exchanging a quick glance with Mom. "We could all skip the potluck." No, I insisted. "I just need quiet and darkness. You all go enjoy yourselves. I will probably just sleep." They left reluctantly, Mom leaving pain relievers and a cold compress beside my bed. "Call if you need anything," she said, kissing my forehead. "We will have our phones on." As their car pulled from the driveway, I waited 10 additional minutes to ensure they would not return for forgotten items. Then I moved quickly, retrieving my old emergency key from inside a hollowed-out book on my bookshelf where I had hidden it years ago. Dad's desk drawer yielded another key, likely for the new deadbolt. I took both and approached my bedroom door, heart pounding against my ribs. Standing before the door, I listened carefully. Silence. With trembling hands, I inserted the newer key into the deadbolt. It turned with a solid click. Then I used my old key for the original doorknob lock. Another click. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob. Whatever I discovered would change everything. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Antiseptic, medicinal, with an underlying metallic scent I recognized from hospital visits. The room was dimly lit by a small lamp, curtains drawn against the morning light. For a moment, my eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. When they did, I froze in shock. My childhood bedroom had been transformed into a medical ward. My bed was replaced by a hospital bed with raised sides. IV stands flanked it, bags of fluid dripping through tubes. A cardiac monitor beeped softly, displaying vital signs. Oxygen tanks stood in the corner next to a tray of medical instruments. My desk now held medications, syringes, and charts. My bookshelves contained medical supplies instead of textbooks and trophies. And in the bed lay a middle-aged Hispanic woman, her face pale and drawn with illness. She appeared to be sleeping, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. An IV line ran into her arm, and an oxygen cannula rested beneath her nose. I must have gasped because her eyes fluttered open. Confusion crossed her face, followed by fear. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice weak. "Where is Elizabeth?" "I am Melissa, Elizabeth's daughter," I answered automatically. "Who are you?" "Maria," she replied, attempting to sit up but wincing in pain. "Please do not call the police. Your mother is saving my life." I approached the bed cautiously, medical knowledge from my psychology courses and Thomas's studies allowing me to interpret the equipment surrounding her. The monitor showed an elevated heart rate and low blood pressure. A chart by the bed detailed medication schedules and vital sign tracking in my mother's meticulous handwriting. "What happened to you?" I asked, still trying to process the reality before me. Maria explained between labored breaths. She had developed a severe infection after an appendectomy. Without insurance, the hospital discharged her with only a prescription for antibiotics she could not afford. When she returned with worsening symptoms, they refused readmission without payment up front. My mother had been her nurse and witnessed her being turned away despite dangerous vital signs. "Your mother found me in the parking lot," Maria said. "I was planning to sleep in my car because I felt too sick to drive home. She brought me here instead." Tears filled her eyes. "I have 3 children. They need me. Your parents said they would help until I was stable enough to go home." On the desk, I found Maria's medical file. It detailed a post-surgical infection that had developed into sepsis, a life-threatening condition. Mom had been administering IV antibiotics, fluids, and pain management. Notes tracked her improving condition over 2 weeks of care. Another folder contained Maria's personal information. She worked 2 jobs as a house cleaner and restaurant server. Her husband had been deported 3 years ago, leaving her the sole provider for their children, ages 8, 12, and 15. They lived in a small apartment 30 miles away, and her oldest was currently watching the younger siblings, believing their mother was staying with a friend while recovering. The final document made my blood run cold. A waiver signed by Maria absolving my parents of responsibility should her treatment fail. It was an attempt at legal protection, though I doubted it would hold up in court if discovered. As I processed this information, I noticed a medical textbook open to a page on antibiotic treatments for sepsis. Mom had been researching the most effective approaches. A notebook contained consultations with someone identified only as Dr. K, who had apparently provided guidance anonymously. Maria watched me anxiously. "Your mother comes every few hours to check on me. Your father helps at night. They are good people." She reached for my hand. "Please understand. I would have died without them." The reality of the situation sank in fully. My parents had established an illegal medical facility in our home. Mom was practicing medicine outside her nursing scope. They were obtaining prescription medications and medical equipment illegally. If discovered, my mother would lose her license and likely face criminal charges. My father would be considered an accomplice. Yet their motives were purely compassionate. They were saving a woman who had been abandoned by the healthcare system, a mother whose children needed her. As I stood in this surreal scene that had once been my childhood sanctuary, the ethical complexity overwhelmed me. The psychological concepts of justice, care, and moral reasoning I had studied in the abstract were now painfully concrete. Maria's monitor began beeping more rapidly. Her blood pressure was dropping. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool room. Without thinking, I checked her IV line and found it was nearly empty. The next dose of antibiotics sat prepared in the mini refrigerator beside the bed, labeled in Mom's handwriting with the time for administration. This woman needed proper medical care, not a secret bedroom operation, regardless of how well-intentioned. She required resources only a hospital could provide, yet calling for help might destroy my family. As I stood frozen in indecision, I heard the front door open. My parents had returned early. "Melissa," my mother's voice called from downstairs. Footsteps approached rapidly, and the bedroom door pushed open wider. Mom stood in the doorway, still wearing her church clothes, face draining of color as she saw me standing beside Maria's bed. "What are you doing in here?" she whispered. Though the question was unnecessary, the evidence surrounded us. Dad appeared behind her, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Kyle and Jessica are downstairs," he said quietly. We told them to wait in the living room. For a long moment we stared at each other, the secret fully exposed between us. Then Maria's monitor alarm sounded, breaking the standoff. Mom immediately switched to nurse mode, rushing to check Maria's vitals. "Her pressure is dropping. The infection might be resistant to the current antibiotics." She worked quickly, adjusting the IV flow and checking Maria's temperature. James, get my kit from our bedroom. Dad hesitated, looking at me. Melissa, we need to talk about this, but right now, go, I said. Help her first. As Dad hurried away, I watched my mother work with practiced efficiency, speaking soothingly to Maria while checking her condition. Despite the illegal nature of what she was doing, her competence was undeniable. How long has this been happening? I asked. 2.5 weeks, Mom answered without looking up. Maria came to the ER with post-surgical complications, severe infection, early sepsis. She needed IV antibiotics, monitoring, and possibly surgical debridement. But when the financial office discovered she had no insurance and could not pay, they ordered discharge with oral antibiotics only. That cannot be legal, I said. It happens every day. Her voice hardened. They call it financial triage. I argued with the attending physician, but he claimed his hands were tied by administration. When I found Maria in the parking lot, nearly unconscious, I could not just leave her there. Dad returned with a medical bag. Together, they administered medication and stabilized Maria's condition. I stood back, watching my parents work as a seamless team, clearly not their first time handling a crisis together. Once Maria was resting comfortably again, Dad gestured toward the hallway. We should talk downstairs. In the kitchen, with Kyle and his girlfriend sent to pick up food, my parents finally explained everything. They were part of an underground network of healthcare workers providing care to patients rejected by the system. Mom had previously offered advice and supplies, but Maria was the first patient they had brought home, only because her condition was too severe to ignore. What you are doing is practicing medicine without a license, I said to Mom. You could go to prison. I know the risks, she replied steadily, but I also know what happens to patients like Maria when they are abandoned by the system. They die. Slowly and painfully, they die. After 23 years as a nurse, I cannot stand by and watch it happen anymore. Dad explained his role, converting my bedroom, obtaining supplies through construction contacts who had access to medical equipment, and monitoring Maria at night when Mom needed rest. His construction knowledge had allowed him to install medical gas lines and proper electrical outlets to support the equipment. We plan to tell you after she recovered, Dad said. Another week of antibiotics, and she should be stable enough to continue recovery at home with oral medication. We did not want you involved or at risk. But I am involved now, I pointed out, and what you are doing, while compassionate, is dangerous. What if she had developed complications you could not handle? What if she died here? Mom's face showed the weight of that possibility. We have an emergency plan. A doctor friend would help transfer her to the hospital if absolutely necessary. And what story would you tell then? How would you explain her condition? My parents exchanged glances. Clearly they had considered this scenario, but had no good solution. Maria has 3 children, Mom said softly. Her oldest is only 15. Without her, they would enter the foster system, likely be separated. The youngest has asthma and needs consistent care. Her husband was deported despite living here legally for 12 years, all because of paperwork errors he could not afford to fight. The system has failed this family at every turn. I refuse to be another person who turns away. I understood their motivation, but the reality remained stark. You could lose everything, Mom. Your career, your freedom. Dad could face charges too. Have you really thought this through? Every day, she answered. Every single day I think about the risks. But I also think about my oath as a nurse, to do no harm. Sometimes inaction is the greatest harm of all. As we talked, I learned more about the underground healthcare network. Doctors provided consultation off the record. Pharmacists diverted soon-to-expire medications that would otherwise be destroyed. And medical suppliers misplaced equipment that found its way to patients in need. Mom had been involved for years, but had never brought patients home until Maria's desperate situation. The system is broken, Dad said, his voice heavy with frustration. We pay more for health care than any country in the world, yet people die because they cannot afford basic treatment. I never thought we would do something like this, but when your mother brought Maria home that night, barely conscious and burning with fever, what choice did we have? I thought of my psychology ethics courses, the discussions about healthcare disparities and moral responsibility. The theoretical had become intensely personal. If Maria dies here, you both go to prison, I said bluntly. Her children lose their mother anyway, and I lose both parents. Is that helping anyone? Mom's eyes filled with tears. What would you have us do? Let her die in a parking lot? Before I could answer, Maria's monitor alarm sounded from upstairs, the tone indicating a critical situation. We rushed back to the bedroom to find her seizing, her body rigid and oxygen levels plummeting. Mom acted immediately, turning Maria on her side and administering emergency medication. Dad called someone on a burner phone, speaking in urgent tones about the contingency plan. As the seizure subsided, Mom looked at me with resignation in her eyes. Her condition is worsening. We need to get her to a hospital. We cannot provide the level of care she needs anymore. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. I pulled out my phone. I am calling 911, I announced, but not to report you, to save her. My parents froze as I dialed the emergency number, but neither moved to stop me. In that moment, I realized they had known all along that this might be inevitable, that their makeshift medical operation had limitations they could not overcome. When the operator answered, I spoke calmly, despite my racing heart. We need an ambulance at 127 Mapleton Drive. We have a woman with severe post-surgical infection, possible sepsis. She is having seizures and needs immediate medical attention. As I provided Maria's vital signs and symptoms, Mom quickly began removing evidence of long-term care, storing away charts and personal items. Dad disconnected non-essential equipment, making the room appear less like an established medical space and more like an emergency response situation. The ambulance is on its way, I told them after hanging up. We need a story, fast. Together, we constructed a narrative. Maria was a family friend who had been discharged from the hospital but came to our house when she felt worse. Mom, as a nurse, recognized the serious symptoms and provided emergency care while waiting for the ambulance. The story contained enough truth to be believable, while protecting my parents from the most serious legal implications. Maria, Mom said gently, taking her hand, paramedics are coming to take you to the hospital. If anyone asks, you came here today seeking help because you remembered I was a nurse. You have never been here before today. Do you understand? Maria nodded weakly. You saved my life. I will not get you in trouble. Dad gathered Maria's personal belongings into a bag, removing any evidence of her extended stay. I helped Mom change the sheets to fresh ones that would not show signs of long-term use. We worked quickly, transforming the space from a long-term care facility to the scene of an emergency response. What about her medical records? I asked. In the safe, Dad replied. I will handle them later. We heard sirens approaching just as Mom finished administering another dose of medication to keep Maria stable. The transformation of the room was remarkable, now appearing as though we had hastily set up emergency care for someone who had just arrived. 2 paramedics arrived with a stretcher, efficiently assessing Maria's condition. Mom explained the situation using our agreed-upon story, her professional nursing demeanor, lending credibility. I recognized sepsis symptoms and started an IV while waiting for you to arrive, she told them, her voice steady, despite the lies of omission. Her post-surgical wound shows signs of infection. She was discharged 3 days ago but deteriorated rapidly. The paramedics focused on stabilizing Maria for transport, asking technical questions that Mom answered with precision. I stood back, observing how easily my mother navigated the interaction, providing critical information while carefully avoiding any mention of Maria's prolonged stay. My psychology training helped me maintain a calm exterior despite my churning thoughts. When one paramedic asked how Maria had arrived at our house, I smoothly interjected. She took an Uber, I said. She knew my mom was a nurse and came here when she started feeling confused and feverish. As they prepared to transport Maria, a police officer arrived. Standard procedure for emergency calls. He asked additional questions about the situation. Dad stepped forward, his respected position in the community evident in his confident manner. Officer Daniels, good to see you, he said, recognizing the officer from local community events. Terrible situation here. Maria is a friend of the family. She showed up at our door, very ill. Thank goodness Elizabeth was home to help until the ambulance arrived. The officer seemed satisfied with the explanation, particularly coming from my father, whose construction company had built several municipal buildings and who had served in the military before starting his business. The community connections my parents had established over decades provided a shield of credibility. Before leaving, Maria grasped my hand. Thank you, she whispered. Tell your parents thank you for everything. As the ambulance departed, we stood in the driveway, the adrenaline of the situation beginning to fade. The police officer informed us which hospital Maria was being taken to and suggested we follow later once things settled. Back inside, the empty bedroom stood as evidence of what had transpired over the past weeks. The hospital bed, medical equipment, and lingering antiseptic smell all testified to my parents' secret operation. "What happens now?" I asked. Mom sighed, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. "I will call Dr. Kaplan. He works in the ER and will ensure Maria receives proper care. He is part of our network and understands the situation and her medical bills." Dad asked, "There is a charity care program?" Mom explained, "Dr. Kaplan will help navigate the application. With her financial situation, she should qualify." I watched my parents, seeing them in an entirely new light. Their willingness to risk everything to help a stranger revealed a depth of compassion I had always sensed but never fully understood. "You could have told me," I said softly. "We wanted to protect you," Dad replied. "The less you knew, the better." "I am not a child anymore," I reminded them. "I understand the complexity of what you were trying to do." Mom reached for my hand. "Are you going to report us? We would understand if you felt you had to." The question hung heavy between us. I considered everything I had learned, both about my parents and about the broken healthcare system that had created this impossible situation. "No," I finally answered. "But this cannot happen again. Not like this. There have to be better ways to help people without putting our entire family at risk." Relief washed over their faces, followed by solemn nods of agreement. We spent the rest of the day dismantling the medical setup, returning my bedroom to some semblance of its former self. Each piece of equipment removed represented a piece of the story I would carry with me forever, a profound lesson in ethical complexity and human compassion. That evening, we received word from Dr. Kaplan that Maria was responding well to hospital treatment. She would survive, and he had arranged for her case to be reviewed for the hospital's financial assistance program. Our dangerous gamble had worked, at least for one desperate mother and her children. 1 week later, I sat in a coffee shop near the hospital, waiting nervously. Maria had been discharged the previous day, her infection finally under control thanks to proper medical treatment. She had agreed to meet me away from my parents for a conversation I felt was necessary for my own closure. She arrived looking transformed from the desperately ill woman I had discovered in my bedroom. Color had returned to her face, and though she moved carefully, the immediate danger had passed. "How are you feeling?" I asked as she sat down. "Much better," she smiled. "The doctors say I can return to work in 2 weeks. Light duty at first." We spoke about her children, who had finally learned the truth about their mother's condition. Her 15-year-old son had taken on tremendous responsibility during her absence, caring for his siblings while believing his mother might not survive. "What will happen with the hospital bills?" I asked. "Dr. Kaplan helped me apply for charity care. They approved it yesterday. I pay nothing." She shook her head in disbelief. "If your mother had not helped me, I would have died trying to avoid those bills. Instead, they are forgiven." The irony was painful. The same hospital that had turned her away now provided free care, but only after her condition had deteriorated to critical and required more extensive intervention. The system had failed, then finally worked, but only after unnecessary suffering and risk. "I want to help you," I told her. "I am studying psychology, but I have friends in legal aid. They can help with your immigration situation, maybe find a way to appeal your husband's deportation." Her eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do this?" "Because what happened to you should never happen to anyone, and because my parents risked everything to help you, which means you matter, your family matters." That conversation changed my trajectory. When I returned to Stanford after Thanksgiving break, I added pre-law courses to my psychology major. I began volunteering at a community health clinic serving undocumented immigrants and others without insurance. Thomas supported my new direction, even joining me at the clinic where his medical knowledge proved invaluable. My relationship with my parents transformed as well. The secret we now shared created a new dimension of understanding. We spoke more openly about the systemic issues that had driven them to such desperate measures. Mom began working with healthcare advocacy groups, channeling her frustration into legitimate activism rather than underground operations. Dad used his community connections to support a free clinic expansion, donating construction services and rallying other businesses to contribute. 3 months after my discovery, Mom received a letter from Maria. She had recovered completely and returned to both jobs. The legal aid attorneys I had connected her with were helping with her husband's case with promising developments. Her children were doing well in school, especially her oldest son, who now wanted to become a doctor. "To help people like your mother help me," he wrote. The letter included a family photo, all 4 of them smiling in front of their small apartment. Mom framed it and kept it on her desk, a reminder of why ethical lines sometimes blur when systems fail the vulnerable. As for my childhood bedroom, it returned to normal, though I would never see it the same way again. The telescope still stood by the window, but now it symbolized a different kind of vision, one that looked beyond immediate circumstances to see larger patterns of injustice and possibility. My psychology professors noticed the change in my class participation, the way I approached ethical discussions with newfound complexity. One mentor commented that I seemed to have matured years in a single semester. She had no idea how accurate her observation was. The experience fundamentally altered my understanding of right and wrong. I had always viewed ethics as relatively straightforward, with clear boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable actions. Now I recognize the gray areas, where compassion and justice sometimes conflict with law and professional standards. My senior thesis focused on healthcare disparities and the psychological impacts of medical debt, inspired directly by Maria's story. The research led to an invitation to speak at a healthcare policy conference, where I carefully shared anonymized versions of stories like Maria's, advocating for systemic change while protecting the individuals involved. In quiet moments, I still wrestle with the questions raised by my parents' actions. Was what they did right? It saved a life, but endangered our family. Was it justified? The system had failed, but they created new risks. Would I have done the same? Before that Thanksgiving break, I would have said no without hesitation. Now I am less certain. What I know with absolute clarity is that no one should have to choose between financial ruin and necessary medical care. No healthcare provider should be forced to decide between their professional obligations and their moral compass. No family should become an underground hospital ward because legitimate institutions failed in their basic purpose. Maria's story had a positive ending. But for every patient who finds help, countless others suffer in silence, victims of a system that treats healthcare as a privilege rather than a right. My parents' desperate solution was not sustainable, but their underlying motivation, their refusal to accept preventable suffering, remains a guiding principle in my life. As I prepare to graduate and begin law school with a focus on healthcare policy, I carry this experience as both a burden and a gift. It complicates my understanding of ethics, but clarifies my purpose. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from moments when our moral certainties collapse, forcing us to rebuild a more nuanced understanding of justice and compassion. The line between right and wrong is rarely as clear as we wish it to be. Sometimes the most ethical choice is not the legal one. Sometimes saving a life requires risking your own. These are not comfortable truths, but they are truths nevertheless, written in the story of my childhood bedroom and the stranger who found healing there. What would you do if faced with such an impossible choice? Would you follow the rules or follow your conscience when a life hangs in the balance? If you have ever witnessed a situation where doing the right thing meant breaking the rules, share your experience in the comments below. Remember to like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about the complex moral dilemmas we face in our broken healthcare system. Together, perhaps we can work toward a world where such impossible choices become unnecessary.